So without further ado, Mother Nature, the silent storm in the markets. So Bruce Burnett here is the director of Markets and Weathers, MarketsFarm, Glacier Farm Media. That's probably too long of a title here. Anyway, Bruce here has been living and breathing Western Canadian agriculture for over 30 years. The combination of practical experience gained by growing up on a farm in Western Manitoba and years of monitoring global weather and markets for the Canadian Wheat Board gives Bruce a unique perspective on the agriculture markets. His specialty is the analysis of weather conditions and their impact on global agricultural markets. Please welcome Bruce.
Thanks. Well, it's good to be here. I was talking to the next speaker, Rob, just before the talk here, and saying it's just like us weather speakers to pick the coldest day of the year, and we probably have not done too badly to pick the coldest day of the year. But anyway, the purpose of this talk is to go through some of the weather events to take a look at when you're formulating your marketing plan in the upcoming year. And the reason that I call it the silent storm is we have another storm that's constantly reminding us that weather and production and supply and demand don't always have impacts on the markets. Certainly, I think the markets are almost overly focused on the political situation, the trade situation, and don't get me wrong, I think they're important, but certainly weather has had a big impact so far this year and could potentially have an even larger impact as we go forward. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit about El Nino, get into that, especially in regards to the Australian drought, which I think for the wheat market is very important as we move forward. Also for Indian dryness, especially for anyone in the pulse markets here, that's something to keep a close eye on. I'm not particularly worried necessarily about the current Rabi crop, but certainly below normal performance of the monsoon could have a big impact on Indian agriculture for the next year. Also, what does the future, given we're in an El Nino mean? Winter weather in North America, we'll go through that. The monsoon, as I talked about, and as well Brazilian corn. And I think this is an important factor going forward here. We focused a bit on the Brazilian production on the soybean side and some of the problems that they've had through the month of December. But really, I think the crop that's going to be impacted the most, and particularly if a typical El Nino pattern sets up in Brazil, is it's going to impact the corn crop there. Also talk a little bit about the Pacific North American Index. It is also a factor, especially in terms of rain coast rainfall and snowfall in BC, which could impact our transportation and logistics to some extent. So I'm going to start off with a soil moisture map globally. I like this map. It gives you a pretty good indication of where things are dry. If you want to see the impact of the U.S. shutdown, this is the November map. Now, it's a good thing because really soil moisture doesn't change dramatically month to month. So this probably holds true for December, but we should have the December map by now. But Mr. Trump and Congress will figure out when we'll get to see it. I've got some circles here on some important areas. Australia is dry. India is also showing some dryness. We were talking about that earlier. South Africa is dry. Those are all indicators of problems that we have or associate with an El Nino. The other thing is these drier areas up in Brazil. Talk a little bit about that because that's where I think the potential corn problems could result. In North America, we basically are dry in the prairies. I think basically that's something that's been developing for 2 years here. And we'll talk a little bit about what the summer weather will have, although I think Rob's going to go into it in far more detail. The other area that's dry and it's not associated with El Nino is up in Europe. European areas have been dry. They did recover a bit in December, but there are still some dry regions there. I think that possibly could have something to say in terms of the markets as we move forward, especially the wheat market as that crop comes out of dormancy. So El Nino, let's take a look at it. First of all, it's not an official El Nino yet. U.S. is in an El Nino watch. Australia Met Bureau is in an El Nino alert. So in other words, we haven't declared it yet. Regardless of how you look at it, it's going to be a weak El Nino, I think, this year, although the impacts have been pretty extensive. I just wanted to quickly go through this just so that you have some understanding of what happens in this situation. The top is a neutral phase, or what we would normally expect in the Pacific Ocean. And again, El Nino is in this area here along the equatorial Pacific. You have a cool water current up the west coast of South America. It stretches up even into North America here. That causes the air in the atmosphere to subside. Trade winds take it to the east, then it gets warmed by a pool of warm water in Southeast Asia, rises and then comes back. And so it's a sort of a circular motion here. What happens to an El Nino is this is completely turned around, and you get this warm area across the Pacific, and that causes rising in the west and disrupts this pattern and actually cools off the area in Asia. So this disruption is what's a concern. Now, the reason that we're not in a full El Nino right now is the fact that although we're seeing the warmth in these waters, we're not seeing big changes in terms of the atmospheric circulation yet. So again, I call it a sort of almost an El Nino this year, and we're seeing impacts already. So this is the average sea surface temperature anomaly. In other words, the difference from normal for the last month, essentially from just before Christmas to the 19th of December. And you can see again, we're looking at deviations here between 0.5 degree and about 1.5 to 2 degrees. So again, that pool of warm water is there, and we are disrupting some of the circulation. But as I said, it's not far enough along for people to actually declare it. So what happens if we get into this warm episode, as we call it, El Nino episode, and where are the impacts? And this is for December through February. If you take a look at the two areas where we're going to have impacts, Australia is usually still warm, and they have been very warm here as we've gone through December and into the first part of January. In South America, we've seen this pattern where there's some warmth and dryness in northern Brazil and some wetness in Argentina. And this is what the markets are focused on right now, especially for both soybean production, but it also did impact wheat production. The other thing I would like to point out is we're also going to see some warmth, typically during an El Nino here in Asia, including dry and warm in Southeast Asia. For those of you who are here for the palm oil oilseed presentation by Oil World, this is the region that gets impacted by an El Nino and reduces palm oil production. So palm oil I would be definitely concerned about, not necessarily for this production cycle, but for the next production cycle. Also, you can see there's also a dry and warm area here in South Africa. That impacts especially their corn production, so we'd expect that to drop. And that's a consistent message here. I think the global corn supplies are shrinking, and it's mostly because of the fact that we're seeing Brazil, which is a large producer, South Africa, which isn't necessarily a big producer, but a big exporter to the region, are both probably going to come up with crops that are a little less than are currently estimated. So let's take a look at Australia. Here's the December temperatures. Across eastern Australia, you were 3-4 degrees above normal. Again, this is during their summertime, so that means some tremendously hot temperatures. In terms of impacting crops, I mean, again, this is harvest period for their wheat, but they'd gone through a long dryness throughout the growing season. This is 1st of October through the end of December. You can see for most of eastern Australia, and that's the region impacted by El Nino, you can see the percent of normal, basically well below normal, down to almost 50% of normal in some parts of northwestern South Australia, northeastern South Australia, and into northwestern New South Wales. The western areas you'll note in Australia, again, weren't impacted, but that's something that we would anticipate during an El Nino. Western Australia doesn't really have a strong El Nino signal, and that's actually where most of the exportable wheat supplies are going to be in Australia this year. Drought in the east, problems in the west. If you want to see the impact of this dryness on Australia, here's the current estimates. Basically 17 million tons on wheat, the smallest crop in over a decade. If you look at the barley production, again, smallest crop in over a decade, considerably below the 2016-17 year, which was when they had record production essentially in Australia. So Australian supplies are limited. As we move through this marketing year, again, Canadian exporters should pick up business both on the barley, but especially on the wheat side as we move through the rest of our marketing year essentially here in the prairies. Another hallmark of the El Nino is this wetness in southern Brazil, northern Argentina into Uruguay. And this again is the December percent of normal. You can see Uruguay between 200 and 400%, or twice to 4 times normal. Most of it was around 2.5 times normal. Very wet conditions for harvesting. Wheat crops did get impacted by these poor conditions during the harvest period here. Production was good, like in terms of supplies, but they just ran into some problems on the quality side. If you take a look at Argentinian corn production, though, they're planting their corn crop right now. They have all that nice moisture that just came. So again, we'd expect their production to actually increase this year. If you remember last year in the markets, both for soybeans and for corn, there was a huge drought in Australia, and that caused shortfall, or in Argentina, that caused shortfall. We're looking for, at MarketsFarm here, we're expecting production to actually go up, and in Argentina, probably going to be a little bit higher than 2 years ago. There is a concern about wetness and flooding. Having been through that region a number of times in my life, I would say the area is probably a little better drained than people anticipate. A lot of the areas that are flooded are actually cattle pasture areas. So what happens in North America for El Nino? This is sort of the typical setup for North America. You have a warmer than normal trend for our winter. This is again just for the winter season. And a very strong Pacific jet down in the south, or southern jet stream. And you see above normal precipitation and cool weather down in the southern US. Well, we've certainly been dry here in Western Canada. We have essentially gone through, this is for the last 60 days. So in other words, since the end of November, you can see most of the prairies has had less than half normal precipitation. Some areas even less than that. So we have been dry. That's characteristic. We've actually been also above normal. This is November. Again, if you remember November here on the eastern prairies, it was pretty cold, but actually out in the western areas, it was warmer than normal. If you look at December, and again, please ignore the areas where there's some bad data showing up in this map, but we were looking at temperatures basically 3 degrees above normal across most of the prairies during December. January is probably going to be a bit above normal, despite the fact that we've been very cold here on the eastern prairies, and certainly in the western prairies would be above normal. So we're seeing the typical impacts of El Nino on our weather here in the prairie region. Now, so basically the question is, are we in an El Nino? And I say, well, the experts can debate this, whether or not we're going to be in a true El Nino this year or not, but if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it generally is a duck. This El Nino, this duck is an El Nino. It's looking like one as well in terms of the impacts. So I want to concentrate in 2 areas right now and how they're going to impact crops as we go through this next growing season. This again is the December through February period, and we're looking at the areas down in the southern U.S., as well as this dryness in northern areas of Brazil. So first off is Brazil. This is the December percent of normal. The dryness, or the dry area that people are talking about, are here in Mato Grosso do Sul and down into Paraná. Up in the north in Mato Grosso itself, actually conditions were mixed. Pretty close to normal precipitation during December. The growing conditions, talking to people from Mato Grosso, I think essentially the yields are down a little bit from last year, but no big disaster. That's important because Mato Grosso is the largest producing state. They're going to produce somewhere between 32, 33 million tons of soybeans this year. So basically that region, I think, is pretty good. They've got about 15% of the crop harvested up in those northern areas of Brazil already. So again, if you're doing the math on this, Brazil already is starting, in terms of the northern areas, they probably have between 5 and 7 million tons of crop already harvested. So getting close to the Canadian soybean production already harvested in the country. The beans down in the further south here are still in the vegetative to potting stage. They do need some rains. They got some rains last week, so that really helped out, but they're going to need some more as we go along, and markets are going to pay very close attention to that. If you take a look at some of the remote sensing imagery from the region, you can see up in these northern areas, again, the circles are a bit out of line here, but again, this is the Mato Grosso region up here. Certainly the crops are still in good condition, and as I said, they've already started the harvest there. Down in the south, a little bit worse off. So again, we'll be looking at a production in Brazil this year that's not a record, but again, it's going to be still reasonably good given the crop cycle. If you take a look, and again, bear with me a little bit, but Argentina has a lot of moisture, so I would expect their production to be a lot higher than last year. You can see the two big producers in South America, we're going to probably be still producing a record crop here. And that's even with a drop off of about 5 million tons in Brazilian production or so. This is a picture I took of 4 or 5 years ago. I think it's an important thing for people to remember when we're talking about Brazilian corn. This is a picture in Mato Grosso on BR 163, the big soybean road. There's a picture of a combine pulling out, just finished this soybean field here. This is a soybean field in the distance that's been harvested, and you can see the planters already out there. Generally speaking, in those northern areas of Brazil, it's a 2-crop rotation. It's generally soybeans and then corn, cotton, sugarcane even if sugar prices are good. But they've essentially settled into this corn and bean rotation. So they plant the corn right after the soybeans are off. Literally, you will see combines harvesting and the planters going right behind the combines. The reason for this is twofold. One is they're required by the government to plant another crop, so they want to get it in right away. And the second thing is the precipitation drops off significantly when you move into April. April and May are drier in these northern areas of Brazil. And so basically they want to get the corn in and get most of the growth done before that dry season comes. So certainly I think for every soybean acre, and they planted again another large soybean area, you're going to get another corn acre. That's why corn in Brazil is becoming more and more a significant factor in the world market. Here's Brazilian corn production. We have it down over 2 years ago, up from last year. But again, with an El Nino developing, and if those areas get dry prematurely, sometime February, March, it's an area to watch because I think we could probably get down closer to last year's production level, down about 84 million tons, 83, 84 million tons. So if we get production down to 85 million tons, with the strong demand we're seeing for corn globally, that's going to be very, very supportive for prices, I think, as we move through this corn marketing year for your corn producers out there. I'll talk quickly about the Pna Index as well. It's somewhat associated with El Nino, but I don't want to go too far in the weeds on you on this. This is a negative phase for Pna, so you have a upper low in the Gulf of Alaska, high pressure system off the coast of North America. For the positive phase, you have high pressure up just a little further north in the Gulf of Alaska, and a low pressure, fairly permanent low pressure in the west coast of North America, and high pressure in the south. This allows the Pacific, this is a conduit for Pacific moisture to move onshore into western North America. Here's a very dodgy chart here, but you can see by the arrow, the Pna indices from last year have gone from negative, now we're quite positive on this, and as I said, it's not a surprise because El Nino is prevailing this year as well. But that does result in the Pineapple Express. You've heard the expression, I'm sure. Again, it's just a bunch of, it's a stream of warm moisture coming from the Pacific around the Hawaiian Islands, piling into Western North America. And it causes some of those impacts that you see in the weather things right now, in the weather data right now. So essentially, here's the positive Pna Index. And you can see there's the Pineapple Express moving on shore here. And essentially, you do get in the lee side of the Rockies, again, a dry trend. It's a fairly typical pattern as well. If we go on to the next slide. So if you look at the U.S. precipitation, has this been active? And you can see West Coast, again, 30-day percent of normal. Most of California, which was burning up 3-4 months ago, suddenly mostly wetter than normal. I think the area impacting crops the most here is in the U.S., and this is a partial thing for the El Nino more than anything else impacting this. You will see that the hard red winter wheat growing areas here in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, considerably above normal here over the past 30 days. They've received a lot of snow. You've probably seen the pictures of snowstorms in Lubbock and places like this. That's very, very significant moisture for that crop because they had been in a dry phase here. So after a reasonably good wet weather in the fall period, they did get the crop planted, and now they have moisture this winter. I'm looking for yields in the hard red winter wheat area to increase. So this is a negative factor for the wheat markets going forward. Stay tuned, but certainly it's something to keep a close eye on, because as those production estimates increase, you probably see the wheat markets be pressured as we go into May, June, July, when they start harvesting this crop. Another area that's important to take a look at with the Pineapple Express is the precipitation out in the West Coast. And I don't know if you saw a story earlier this week on some problems with rail movement in December. Actually, it was more problems with rail movement in Vancouver. And this is the reason why. We had above normal precipitation during the month of December. This is essentially from the first week of December to the first week in January. If you take a look here, this is the precipitation in Vancouver over the month of December. There's 23 days of reported precipitation out of 31. Although, again, it wasn't in the form of snow for the most part. But generally speaking, this is what's been causing some of those problems out there. Vessels have had a tough time loading because, again, you can't load the vessels when you have rain going on. So that reduced the efficiency there. So if we talk about the Pineapple Express associated with El Nino, results in the heavy rainfall in the West Coast. Loading delays in Vancouver, probably the result of that. There's also increasing avalanche concerns in the interior of BC. Some of these systems have moved onshore. And again, related to the stream of warm Pacific air that's moved onshore over the past month to 6 weeks. Just want to quickly talk about Europe because Europe's gone through a relatively dry phase, and that has caused some issues. And again, the old war presentation brought out some of these. First of all is how dry it was during the planting period through September, from September through November. Again, this is percent of normal, so essentially less than half of normal precipitation during the main planting period in Europe, especially up in the northern areas. That's caused farmers here to reduce their rapeseed area, canola area, because again, it's a winter crop across most of Western Europe, and plant wheat instead. That's the same reasons why we, when we get dry, tend to plant more cereals than canola. So that's happened. So we've seen a shift in acreage. Unfortunately, on the wheat market, that means there's a higher area there available for this upcoming year. If you go further east into the former Soviet Union, into Ukraine, southern Russia, you can see they've also been dry through the main planting period. I have some concerns about the Russian and Ukrainian crops this year. They have picked up some moisture. They did have enough to get it germinated, but they certainly are going to have to see some good spring rains here. And unlike Western Europe, these areas sometimes do get dry stay dry fairly long after the crops moved out of dormancy. Any hint of problems in this region would probably certainly, would certainly move the markets considerably higher, because everyone's expecting a larger crop out of out of Russia this year, as well as Ukraine. So again, just to go over those points, the rapeseed area is lower in France and from France to Poland due to the dry conditions. Basically, the durum area also dropped for those few who are in the audience that farm durum, grow durum. Winter wheat area is expected to rise, so a larger winter wheat area, but it is dry there, so it's something to monitor over the spring conditions. So we're going to wrap up here with what are the impacts June through August of an El Nino. Basically, you say, well, Bruce, you have an El Nino going on. First of all, the El Nino will probably degrade by the time we get into this period of time, so this might be a moot point. But the thing I wanted to point out, and you see the arrow with the word El Nada, which is my term for the neutral phase, essentially that you can see there's no impact in North America. So I think basically during the spring and summer, we turn back into a more normal weather pattern. A lot of questions I've been asked as to, are we going to be as dry this summer as we've been the last two? I don't think so. Yeah, atmospheric conditions I think are going to be a little bit different than we've had over the past 2 years. So again, that hot, dry, persistent conditions I don't think are going to hang around this year. So here's my wind-up slide. El Nino is here. It's already having an impact. Australia, South Africa, India are already dry. Look for the dryness in northern Brazil as we move through the next 3 to 4 months, because that's going to be critical for that corn crop, and that certainly is going to move corn prices, I think, as we go forward. Corn prices are sort of the international base price. If we see good support for that, that also means the other markets are going to remain a little bit more positive. The Pna is positive. It may slow the exports out the West Coast. The one thing I will say about the exports out of the West Coast, despite some of those problems that they did have in December, tonnages still appear to be moving fairly, have been fairly good. So I don't see that shortfall. We're getting to the point over the next 30 days or so that if we don't see a slowdown in exports, then we will have got through this year with pretty good logistics. And that's something to say when we started to move all this oil by rail as well at the same time. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to have a chance here for some questions. If you have some questions, please shout them out.
Yes, we have 20 minutes for questions, because we can't start the next speaker till 1:45, so we stay on the program. So you have either you ask question, or maybe I'll ask Bruce to keep talking.
Well, I can keep on talking.
Do you have questions in the audience? I'll come with the mic there, wherever they might be. Yes, just hang on.
What about durum? Is the price going to move up at all, and is there going to be movement?
Okay, the question is on durum. And are prices going to improve? Prices have actually started to move up a bit, but there's still a significant discount to spring wheat. For those of you who aren't in the durum space, durum markets have essentially been trading between, the cash markets in Western Canada have been trading between 50 cents and over $1 under the spring wheat values. And that's been essentially since harvest, since a little bit past the harvest time. And it's the long-term, it's the longest time that it's spent at that discount. Like, generally speaking, you're looking for a premium of somewhere in between 25 and 50 cents a bushel. Now, are we going to move back to that? I would say probably not, for the next while at least anyway. Again, we're starting to see bids move up. Some central Saskatchewan, southwestern bids are up, getting close to $7, but for the most part, they're still in the mid $6 a bushel range. The problem with the durum is that Although there's been some demand showing up, it hasn't been huge. And we produced a large crop last year, and we're probably going to carry out about 2.1 or 2.2 million tons of durum this year. So in a crop that is around 5.5 million tons of production, we're carrying out a fair amount for next year. Now, I don't expect the area is going to drop this year significantly, I think, just because of the price relationship right now. But I think it takes another year for us for those prices to move back to maybe more historical standards. If you want a ray of hope, the Mediterranean basin has turned dry. This is the wet period for that region. They need to build up their soil moisture supplies in December, January, and February. Unfortunately for them, fortunately maybe for future demand from Canada, is that they're running about half of normal to 3/4 of normal precipitation in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. So it's a bit too early to tell, but should this continue through February, then I think we'll probably see some additional durum demand come in. Will it be enough to push prices above spring wheat? I don't think so, not this year.
Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Bill?
On red spring wheat, Bruce,
Yep.
there's talk of Russia and Kazakhstan in that area getting tight and maybe putting some export restrictions on. And then at the same time, I've heard rumors that China, to supply protein demands, are maybe thinking of importing quite a bit of wheat. Shouldn't that put the futures up a little bit into the end of the crop year here? And yet our grain buyers around here, if you look at what they're quoting, July is even lower than the cash price right now.
Okay. Now you bring up some excellent points on the wheat market. First of all, Russian supplies are tightening, and prices are increasing. Russian prices since the beginning of their crop year in August basically have gone up about $60 a ton. So we're starting to see this tightness occur. They're still doing business though, and the market's been expecting their business to stop. I think essentially over the next month here, we're likely going to see Russian exports become very uncompetitive to the U.S. values, and the U.S. soft red, but particularly the hard red wheat, which is actually priced lower than soft red right at the moment, will start to move. The biggest problem for futures right now is just the fact that winter wheat exports from the U.S. have just been miserably low. In Canada, we've exported a lot of spring wheat. We're going to pull our carryout possibly even below 4 million tons of wheat excluding durum, without those 2 million plus durum stocks. So I would anticipate the futures are probably going to stage a rally here when we start to see U.S. business arrive. It would be very helpful if the U.S. government went back to work and started doing some of the reports, because then you would get to see that business happen a little bit more. But I think that will happen. China regularly has been buying wheat. The one rumor about 3 weeks ago was that they were going to buy a large pile of U.S. wheat. I think that was probably more in the rumor than the fact category. If that actually was true, they bought 3-4 million tons of U.S. wheat. You would see it in the futures markets very quickly, and it would be worth at least 50 to 75 cents a bushel, I would think. But that hasn't happened. It's been relatively flat. But what the market needs right now is to see some export demand for the winter wheats. On the other hand, spring wheat demand has been relatively strong. I expect the premium for spring wheat over winter wheats, like the spread between the Kansas City and Minneapolis markets, which currently is in the 70s, essentially, the last time I looked at it. I think we probably are going to have to move that up over $1 before the end of this crop year, just because our exports on both sides of the border have been very strong. U.S. wheat, spring wheat has been very competitive, and they've gained a lot of business in Southeast Asia as well. And with this Australian drought, I think that just continues that pipeline of strong exports for wheat. So I'm looking for a wheat rally to come in the next few months. One has to be cautious about it because we will start to trade new crop conditions. And as I showed you, the prospects in the hard red winter wheat area are pretty good. So it probably will be a fairly short-lived rally. But I certainly think we're going to see a rally here, especially on the spring wheat side. Question?
Just hang on here.
India and their pulse crop, is it, there's worries out there that it's getting drier up in India?
Yeah. So conditions have been drier in India. And again, you have to remember, this is the dry part of the year in India. If you're going to go there as a tourist, you're not going to get any rain there, right now, usually. So dry is a relative term, but they have been drier than normal. They also have been cooler than normal, though. And that's probably, for pulses, have offset that a bit. The problem with the India pulse situation is still political, though, I would think, rather than the amount of supply that they're going to generate this year. The political situation there is they're going to have an election in May. They've got over 200 million farmers in the country. The government wants their votes, so they're going to keep import restrictions on, I think, pulses until after that election, and probably even further until they really see the internal prices for pulses really skyrocket. Now, those prices have gone up, but they're nowhere nearly where they were when they had started the import program 4 or 5 years ago. So I think for me, that's a more political situation. Yes, it's getting dry. Yes, that's constructive. It's probably constructive for next year. And especially if that monsoon comes in at a below normal area next year, they're probably going to start to feel some pressure on the price side internally, and that would cause them to change that again after the election is over.
And I answered your question. Okay. We still have time for questions. Going once. Twice. Do you have any more you want to add to what you've said so far? Because we still have time. Can't start till 1:45 for our next speaker, so.
Okay.
Are you done?
Well, if there's no more questions, I think that's about it. Thanks for your attention here. I'm going to be around after here a little bit, so you can get a hold of me, talk to me if there's other things that you want to know about involving my presentation or other. And thanks for your attendance today.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's give Bruce a good hand of applause.